On the morning of April 10, 1974, a letter arrived at apartment 34, Building 7, Leninsky Prospect, Moscow, addressed to Vera Andreevna Volkova. The envelope bore the official stamp of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and inside was a single page of typed text informing her that her husband, Mikhail Andreevich Volkov, had been sentenced to the supreme measure of punishment for crimes against the Soviet state. The sentence had been carried out on March 18, 1974. She was reading this notification 3 weeks after her husband had been executed by firing squad at a labor camp in Mordovia, his body buried in an unmarked grave that she would never be permitted to visit. Vera stood in the narrow kitchen of that apartment, the letter trembling in her hands, and understood with a clarity that felt like drowning that the phone call she had made 8 years earlier had led directly to this moment. But that morning in April 1974 was still years away on a warm afternoon in September 1949, when Vera Nikolaevna Kuznetsova first saw Mikhail Volkov in the library of the Moscow State University. She was 25 years old, the daughter of a party official who had survived the purges through careful loyalty and cautious silence. Mikhail was 27, the son of schoolteachers from Leningrad, and he was standing at the circulation desk arguing passionately with the librarian about whether Lenin's early writings on dialectical materialism should be read chronologically or thematically. Vera found herself drawn not to the argument itself, but to the intensity with which he cared about the answer, as if the proper interpretation of revolutionary theory was a matter of genuine consequence rather than academic exercise. They were married in May 1952, a small ceremony attended by both families and a handful of university friends. And the photograph from that day, which Vera would keep for the rest of her life, shows two young people smiling with the particular confidence of those who believe they understand how the world works and trust that understanding completely. Their daughter, Katya, was born in March 1954, and their son Alexei followed in November 1957. Mikhail worked as a mechanical engineer at Factory Number 47 on the outskirts of Moscow, a position that required security clearance but was not particularly sensitive, and Vera taught history at secondary school number 182, where she was known as a competent if somewhat rigid instructor who adhered closely to the approved curriculum. They lived in a 2-room apartment in a building that housed 6 other families, sharing a communal kitchen and bathroom in an arrangement that was considered relatively comfortable by Soviet standards of the late 1950s. On Sundays, they took the children to Gorky Park. On May Day, they marched in the parades. During the long Moscow winters, Mikhail would read to Katya and Alexei from approved children's books, while Vera prepared their evening meal on the communal stove, negotiating space with neighbors, in a choreography of mutual accommodation that everyone in their building had perfected through years of practice. The changes began gradually, so gradually that Vera would later struggle to identify exactly when she first noticed them. It was sometime during the Khrushchev thaw, that brief period of relative liberalization after Stalin's death, when certain previously forbidden topics could be discussed in careful whispers, when some of those who had been sent to the camps began returning with stories that contradicted the official narratives everyone had been taught to believe. Mikhail had a colleague at the factory, a man named Boris Antonovich, who had been released from a labor camp in Kazakhstan in 1956 after serving 8 years for crimes he insisted he had never committed. Boris spoke carefully, and only to those he trusted, but he spoke, and Mikhail listened. Vera noticed that her husband had become quieter at home, more contemplative, and that he had begun collecting books that were not technically illegal, but were certainly not encouraged. Volumes of pre-revolutionary Russian literature, and translated works of Western philosophy that circulated through informal networks of readers who passed them from hand to hand with the understanding that such transactions were never to be acknowledged openly. In November 1963, Boris Antonovich disappeared. One week he was at the factory, and the next week his workstation was occupied by someone else, and when Mikhail asked what had happened, his supervisor told him curtly that Boris had been transferred to another facility, and that further questions were neither necessary nor advisable. Mikhail came home that evening and sat at their small kitchen table for 2 hours without speaking, and when Vera asked what was wrong, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, and said that he was beginning to understand that everything they had been taught might have been a lie. Vera felt something cold settle in her chest, a sensation that was equal parts fear and anger, because she had been raised to believe that doubt was the first step toward betrayal, and that betrayal was the worst crime a Soviet citizen could commit. She told Mikhail that he needed to be careful, that people were always listening, that their children's futures depended on their family maintaining an unblemished record of political reliability. He nodded and said nothing more that evening, but Vera lay awake long after he had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling of their small bedroom, and wondering what she would do if her husband continued down this path toward whatever waited at the end of it. In January 1965, Mikhail told Vera that he had been invited to join a chess club that met on Thursday evenings, and they both understood immediately that he was lying. The transparency of the deception was itself a kind of message, a signal that he was choosing to do something he knew she would disapprove of, and that he was offering her the option of pretending not to know. Vera said nothing. She simply noted the pattern as it established itself over the following months, that on the first Thursday of each month, Mikhail would leave their apartment at approximately 7:30 in the evening and return between 10:47 and 11:15, always with the same distracted expression, always smelling faintly of tobacco smoke, though he himself did not smoke. She began keeping a diary, a small notebook she hid behind the loose baseboard in their bedroom, and in it she recorded these departures and arrivals with the precision of someone who understood that details might later become important, though she could not yet articulate important for what purpose or to whom. On the evening of March 4, 1965, Vera made a decision that she told herself was motivated by concern for her husband's safety, but that she would later recognize as the beginning of surveillance. She left the apartment 15 minutes after Mikhail, telling Katya, who was now 11, to watch her younger brother until she returned from a brief errand. She followed Mikhail through the Moscow streets, staying far enough back that he would not notice her, but close enough that she did not lose sight of his dark coat and characteristic gait. He took the metro to Arbatskaya station and walked 3 blocks to a pre-revolutionary building with ornate ironwork on the balconies, the kind of structure that had once housed merchants or minor nobility, and now was divided into communal apartments, housing families who were still waiting for the better accommodations the state had promised them. Vera watched from across the street as Mikhail entered through the main door, and she remained there for nearly 2 hours, standing in the cold March darkness, watching windows for any sign of which apartment he might have entered. She saw shadows moving behind curtains on the 3rd floor, heard the faint sound of voices and occasional laughter, but learned nothing definitive. When Mikhail finally emerged at 10:52, she was already gone, having left early enough to arrive home before him and establish the fiction that she had never been anywhere but their apartment. What Mikhail was actually attending, though Vera would not learn the specific details until much later, were gatherings hosted by Dmitry Volkov, a former journalist who had been dismissed from Izvestia in 1962 for refusing to write an article condemning Boris Pasternak. Dmitry's apartment had become a meeting place for 8 to 12 people, who shared an interest in literature and ideas that could not be discussed in official settings, and these gatherings operated under the protection of careful ambiguity. They were not formally organized, had no leadership structure, produced no written materials, and could therefore be defended, if necessary, as nothing more than friends meeting socially to discuss books. But the books they discussed were samizdat, that vast underground network of self-published literature that circulated through Moscow and Leningrad in typewritten copies, passed from hand to hand. And the discussions themselves often turned to questions about Soviet history, about the purges and the camps, and the millions of deaths that had occurred in the name of building socialism. These were not people plotting revolution or advocating for the overthrow of the state. They were simply people who had decided that they would no longer participate in the communal lie that required everyone to pretend that what had happened had not happened, or that if it had happened, it had been necessary and just. In April 1965, Vera found the evidence she had been half-consciously searching for. She was cleaning their shared bookshelf, a task she performed every few months, removing books to dust the shelves and check for the silverfish that sometimes appeared in older Moscow apartments, when she discovered a slim bundle of pages tucked behind a row of technical manuals that Mikhail used for his engineering work. The pages were held together with 2 staples and bore no official publishing marks, and when Vera began reading, she recognized immediately what she was holding. It was an uncensored copy of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the novella that had been published in Novy Mir in 1962, with Khrushchev's explicit approval, but that had since become controversial as the political climate shifted back toward repression. This version, however, contained passages that had been edited out of the official publication, passages describing conditions in the labor camps with a specificity that made Vera's hands shake as she read. She spent 2 days reading the entire manuscript while Mikhail was at work and the children were at school, and when she finished, she carefully returned it to its hiding place exactly as she had found it. The reading experience left Vera deeply unsettled, not because she disbelieved what Solzhenitsyn described, but because possessing such material was dangerous in ways that extended far beyond the person who possessed it. If Mikhail were caught with this manuscript, the consequences would not fall on him alone. Vera would lose her teaching position. Katya would be denied admission to university. Alexei would be marked in his school records as the son of a political criminal. The entire architecture of their lives, built through years of careful adherence to expectations and requirements, would collapse because Mikhail had decided that reading forbidden literature was worth the risk. On May 13, 1965, Vera was summoned to a meeting with her school's principal, a woman named Ludmila Petrovna, who had been in her position for 6 years, and who was known for her meticulous attention to the political reliability of her teaching staff. The conversation began with routine administrative matters, but toward the end, Ludmila Petrovna mentioned casually that she hoped everything was well with Vera's family, and specifically with her husband's activities and associations. The phrasing was deliberately vague, offering Vera the opportunity to volunteer information if she chose, and when Vera responded that her husband was an engineer who worked diligently and caused no problems, Ludmila Petrovna smiled and said that was good to hear, but the smile did not reach her eyes. In October 1965, Mikhail came home from one of his Thursday evening gatherings with news that made Vera's carefully maintained composure finally crack. He told her that the group had decided to move beyond simply reading and discussing forbidden materials, and were planning to produce their own samizdat journal, a monthly publication that would contain essays and commentary on Soviet censorship policies and the suppression of intellectual freedom. He spoke about this plan with an enthusiasm that Vera found terrifying, as if he genuinely believed that writing and distributing criticism of state policy was something that could be done without catastrophic consequences. She asked him to stop, to think about what he was risking, to remember that they had children whose futures depended on their family maintaining an unblemished political record. Mikhail's response, which Vera recorded in her diary that night, was that he could not teach Katya and Alexei to live their lives in fear, that he could not model for them an existence built entirely on lies and self-censorship, that there had to be some point at which a person said enough and refused to participate any longer in the collective deception that Soviet society required of all its citizens. The argument between them intensified over the following weeks, conducted in whispers after the children had gone to bed, and Vera found herself oscillating between fury at Mikhail's recklessness and terror at what she knew was coming. In early November, she discovered printing equipment hidden in the basement of their building, tucked behind old furniture and boxes of belongings that various tenants had stored there over the years. The equipment was crude, a manual typewriter and materials for making carbon copies, but it was enough to produce the kind of publication Mikhail had described. Vera stood in that dim basement, smelling the damp concrete and old wood, and understood that her husband had moved from passive dissent to active production of anti-Soviet materials, and that this crossing of lines meant his arrest was no longer a possibility but an inevitability. The only question was when it would happen and how severe the consequences would be. The calculation that Vera made during those November weeks was one she would spend the rest of her life trying to justify, revise, or escape from. She believed, or told herself she believed, that Mikhail's arrest was unavoidable, that the KGB certainly already knew about the group and was simply waiting for the right moment to move against them. She believed that when that arrest came, the severity of Mikhail's sentence would depend partly on how the authorities perceived the family's overall loyalty, and that if she could demonstrate her own vigilance by reporting the activities before the arrest occurred, the consequences might be less harsh. She believed, most importantly, that by acting first she could protect Katya and Alexei from being permanently marked as the children of a political criminal, that her cooperation with the authorities would serve as evidence that the family as a whole was not infected with anti-Soviet thinking, but that Mikhail alone had strayed from correct ideology. These beliefs formed a structure of justification that allowed Vera to contemplate an action that, without such justification, would have been unthinkable. On December 28, 1965, Mikhail left for another Thursday evening gathering, and Vera sat alone at their kitchen table after Katya and Alexei had gone to bed. The apartment was quiet except for the sounds that always filled Soviet communal buildings at night. The muffled conversations from neighboring apartments, footsteps in the hallway, the distant clatter of someone doing dishes in the shared kitchen. Vera had placed a piece of paper on the table in front of her, the paper that Major Sokolov from the KGB had given her back in September with a phone number written in neat black ink, and she stared at that number for nearly 3 hours. She thought about her father, who had survived the purges of the 1930s by demonstrating absolute loyalty to the party, and by reporting without hesitation any hint of ideological deviation he encountered. She thought about what her father had taught her, that vigilance was not cruelty but a form of love for the motherland, that protecting the Soviet state sometimes required difficult personal sacrifices, that the individual was less important than the collective. She looked at the photographs of Katya and Alexei that hung on the wall near the kitchen window, their young faces smiling at some moment of childhood happiness that Vera desperately wanted to preserve. At 9:47 in the evening, she stood up, walked to the telephone in the hallway that their floor shared, and dialed the number. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Vera provided the address of the building on Arbat Street where the gatherings occurred, confirmed that they took place on the first Thursday of each month, gave the names of the people she knew were involved, including her husband's full name and place of employment, and described the Samizdat journal they were planning to produce. Major Sokolov's voice remained calm and professional throughout, asking occasional questions for clarification. And when Vera had finished, he told her that she had done the right thing, that she was protecting her family and fulfilling her duty as a Soviet citizen. He said that she would likely be asked to provide testimony at some point, but that her cooperation would be noted and would ensure that her own position and her children's futures would not be compromised by her husband's mistakes. Vera hung up the phone, walked immediately to the communal bathroom, and vomited into the toilet, her body rejecting what her mind had decided was necessary. Mikhail returned home at 11:15 that evening and found Vera in bed with the lights off. He undressed quietly and lay down beside her, and she pretended to be asleep, though her heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. In the darkness, she could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, could hear his breathing gradually slow and deepen as he fell asleep, and she thought about how in less than a week, KGB agents would come to this apartment and take him away, and that when they did, he would know, or at least suspect, that she had been the one who made that phone call. The arrest occurred on January 3, 1966, at 6 o'clock in the morning. 3 men in plain clothes entered the apartment after Vera unlocked the door from the inside as she had been instructed to do, and they pulled Mikhail from bed while Katya and Alexei began screaming from their room. The agents were efficient and impersonal, showing their identification, informing Mikhail that he was being detained for questioning regarding anti-Soviet activities, and beginning a systematic search of the apartment that would last nearly 4 hours. They found the Samizdat materials, the printing equipment location that Vera had provided, and various documents and papers that they loaded into boxes and carried away. Through all of this, Mikhail looked at Vera only once, a long, steady look that contained no anger or accusation, but something worse, a kind of sad understanding that would haunt Vera for the rest of her life. In the weeks following Mikhail's arrest, Vera was not permitted to visit him, or to receive any information about his status beyond the formal notification that he was being held in Lefortovo prison, pending investigation and trial. She received one letter from him in mid-February, delivered through official channels with portions clearly redacted by prison censors, in which he wrote that he was being treated adequately and asked how Katya and Alexei were managing. The letter contained no accusations and no bitterness, simply questions about the children's schoolwork and a request that Vera tell them he loved them. The absence of anger in that letter somehow made Vera's guilt more difficult to bear than if he had written pages of condemnation. On February 23rd, she received a summons to appear as a witness at Mikhail's trial, which had been scheduled for March 15, 1966, and along with the summons came instructions to meet with a KGB officer for preparation of her testimony. The officer who coached Vera for her courtroom appearance was a woman named Ekaterina Dmitrievna, younger than Vera had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with a brisk, professional manner that made the preparation sessions feel almost like a school lesson. They met 3 times in a small office in a government building near Dzerzhinsky Square, and during these meetings Ekaterina Dmitrievna explained exactly what questions Vera would be asked and what answers she should provide. Vera was to confirm that Mikhail had been attending unauthorized gatherings, that he had possessed prohibited literature, and that she had attempted on multiple occasions to dissuade him from these activities. She was to present herself as a loyal Soviet citizen who had been placed in the difficult position of choosing between her husband and her duty to the state, and who had ultimately made the correct choice. What Vera was not to mention was how long she had known about Mikhail's activities before reporting them, a timeline that would suggest complicity rather than vigilance. Ekaterina Dmitrievna assured Vera that her cooperation would be noted favorably, and that her teaching position was secure, that Katya and Alexei's school records would remain unmarked, that the promises made to her were being kept. The trial took place in a closed courtroom, which was standard procedure for cases involving political crimes, with only essential personnel present along with a small number of approved observers. Vera entered the building on the morning of March 15th, feeling as though she were moving through water, every action requiring conscious effort, and when she was shown into the courtroom and saw Mikhail sitting at the defendant's table, she experienced a physical shock at how much he had changed in the 10 weeks since his arrest. He had lost weight, his face was thinner and paler, but what struck her most was the stillness in his posture, a quality of resignation that suggested he had already accepted whatever verdict was coming. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds before Vera looked away, unable to sustain the contact, and she took her seat in the witness area with her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. The proceedings moved with bureaucratic efficiency. The judge, a man in his 50s whose name Vera would later be unable to recall, read the charges in a flat, monotone voice. Mikhail Andreevich Volkov was accused of organizing an anti-Soviet group, of producing and distributing materials containing anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, and of conducting systematic anti-Soviet activity over a period of approximately 2 years. The evidence was presented methodically, including copies of the Samizdat journal that the group had been preparing, testimonies from other members who had already been arrested and had provided statements, and documentation of the gatherings at Dmitry Volkov's apartment. Mikhail's defense attorney, a tired-looking man who had clearly been assigned to the case rather than hired, made only perfunctory objections and seemed to be present primarily to fulfill the legal requirement that the defendant have representation rather than to actually mount a defense. When Vera was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with her eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the judge, carefully avoiding looking at Mikhail. She was sworn in, confirmed her identity and her relationship to the defendant, and then answered the questions put to her by the prosecutor. Yes, her husband had been attending unauthorized gatherings on Thursday evenings beginning in early 1965. Yes, she had discovered prohibited literature in their home. Yes, she had attempted to convince him to stop these activities out of concern for their family's welfare. Her voice remained steady throughout, though she could feel sweat gathering at the base of her spine, and her mouth was so dry that the words felt like they were catching in her throat. The prosecutor asked whether Mikhail had expressed anti-Soviet views, and Vera hesitated for just a moment before answering that he had expressed doubts about certain policies, that he had questioned official narratives about historical events. The phrase, doubts about certain policies, appeared later in the trial transcript, preserved in the official record as Vera's characterization of her husband's ideological deviation. Mikhail's own testimony was brief and delivered in a calm voice that showed no fear or defiance, simply a kind of weary honesty. He admitted to all the activities described in the charges, confirmed that he had helped organize the gatherings, and had participated in producing the Samizdat journal, and when asked whether he understood these actions violated Soviet law, he said that he did understand, but that he had acted from conscience and would not pretend otherwise. The judge responded that conscience was not a defense against violation of state security laws, and Mikhail nodded slightly as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. In his final statement before sentencing, Mikhail was permitted to speak for approximately 3 minutes, and he used that time to thank his wife for trying to save him from the consequences of his own choices, words that struck Vera like physical blows, because they contained no sarcasm or cruelty, but seemed genuinely meant. The verdict was delivered the same afternoon, which was standard practice in Soviet political trials where the outcome had been determined before the proceedings began. Mikhail was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 12 years of corrective labor in a camp in the Mordovia region, approximately 400 kilometers southeast of Moscow. The judge specified that the sentence reflected both the serious nature of the crimes and a degree of leniency based on mitigating factors, which Vera understood to be a reference to her cooperation. When the sentence was read, Mikhail showed no reaction beyond a slight nod, as if he were acknowledging information he had already anticipated. Vera sat in the courtroom for several minutes after Mikhail had been led away, unable to make her legs respond to the simple command to stand and leave. And when she finally did rise, Major Sokolov was waiting in the hallway outside. He told her that she had fulfilled a difficult duty with appropriate seriousness, that her teaching position would continue without interruption, and that her children's educational prospects remained unaffected by these events. Vera nodded and walked past him toward the exit, breathing the cold March air when she finally reached the street, and feeling as though she had just participated in her own husband's execution, though she would not understand how literally true that feeling was until 8 years later. In the years following Mikhail's sentencing, Vera constructed what she told herself was a normal life, though normalcy required constant maintenance and careful performance. She continued teaching history at secondary school number 182, and if her colleagues noticed that she had become more rigid in her adherence to approved curriculum, more vocal in her denunciations of Western influence during staff meetings, they said nothing. Katya and Alexei adjusted to their father's absence the way children adjust to most things, by accepting it as the new reality and learning not to ask questions that produced only uncomfortable silences. Vera told neighbors and acquaintances that Mikhail had been transferred to a labor project in another region, an explanation vague enough to discourage follow-up questions while maintaining the fiction that his absence was routine rather than punitive. She wrote to him monthly, letters filled with updates about the children's schoolwork and mundane details about apartment maintenance and weather, and he wrote back less frequently with brief descriptions of camp routine that revealed nothing of what that routine actually entailed. By 1968, Katya had begun asking why they could not visit her father, and Vera's explanations became increasingly strained. The camp was too far away, the journey too expensive. Mikhail was very busy with his work assignments and visits would disrupt his schedule. These were transparent lies that a 14-year-old could easily recognize as such, and the recognition created a distance between Vera and her daughter that would never fully close. Alexei, younger and perhaps more willing to accept adult authority, asked fewer questions but became withdrawn in ways that his teachers noted in school reports. Vera began drinking vodka alone after the children had gone to bed. Not enough to interfere with her responsibilities, but enough to blur the edges of her thoughts and allow her to sleep without the dreams that had begun recurring shortly after the trial. Dreams in which she stood in the courtroom watching Mikhail being sentenced while everyone present turned to stare at her with expressions of cold judgment. In 1970, Mikhail's letters stopped arriving for nearly 4 months, and when Vera finally received correspondence from the camp administration, it was a bureaucratic notice informing her that Mikhail had been transferred to a different facility and providing a new address for future letters. His correspondence resumed after the transfer, but with a different quality, shorter and more withdrawn, mentioning health problems in passing without providing specifics. In 1971, the camp authorities sent notification to families that Mikhail had participated in a prisoner protest, demanding improved medical care and better food rations, and that as a consequence of this participation, 3 additional years had been added to his sentence, and he had been placed in disciplinary isolation for a period of 6 months. Vera's reaction to this news was anger, a hot fury at Mikhail for refusing to simply serve his time quietly, for continuing to act on principle even when principle had already cost him so much. The anger was easier to feel than the guilt beneath it. easier to sustain than the knowledge that her phone call in 1965 had created the circumstances that made every subsequent punishment possible. The vindication Vera told herself she had earned came in 1972, when Katya was accepted to Moscow State University to study mathematics, an achievement that would have been impossible if the family had been formally marked as politically unreliable. Alexei was excelling in his secondary school, showing particular aptitude for physics and engineering, following in some ways the path his father had taken years before. Vera looked at these accomplishments and told herself that her choice in 1965 had been correct, that she had successfully protected her children's futures even at the cost of her husband's freedom. But her relationship with both Katya and Alexei had become performative, polite interactions that maintained the appearance of family while lacking any genuine emotional intimacy. Neither child asked about their father anymore, and Vera did not know whether this silence represented acceptance or abandonment. In the summer of 1973, Vera received a letter from Mikhail that was different from all his previous correspondence. He wrote that he had been diagnosed with tuberculosis, a common illness in the camps where poor nutrition and crowded conditions created ideal circumstances for the disease to spread. He wrote that the diagnosis had given him time to think about their life together, about the choices both of them had made, and that he had been trying to understand why she had done what she did. The letter did not say that he forgave her, did not say that he condemned her, simply stated that he was trying to understand. And Vera found this attempt at understanding more unbearable than anger would have been. She did not respond to that letter. She placed it in the drawer with all his other correspondence and tried to pretend she had never read it, but the words stayed with her, surfacing at unexpected moments when she was teaching a class or preparing dinner or lying awake at night. On February 12, 1974, Vera received official notification from the camp administration that Mikhail had been involved in another incident of anti-Soviet activity, this time organizing discussions among prisoners about political reform and circulating written materials critical of camp conditions. New charges had been filed under Article 70 of the Criminal Code, the same article under which he had been originally convicted, and a supplementary trial had been conducted at the camp with Mikhail receiving an additional sentence. The notification was deliberately vague about the details, using bureaucratic language that obscured more than it revealed, and Vera felt a creeping dread that she could not articulate, but that kept her awake for 3 consecutive nights. The letter that arrived on April 10, 1974, was typed on official stationery and bore the seal of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It informed Vera Andreevna Volkova that her husband, Mikhail Andreevich Volkov, had been found guilty of continued anti-Soviet agitation and had been sentenced to the supreme measure of punishment for crimes against the Soviet state. The sentence had been carried out on March 18, 1974, at the Corrective Labor Facility in Mordovia. His body had been buried in accordance with standard procedures, and no further information regarding the burial location would be provided. The letter was dated April 8th, meaning that Vera was learning of her husband's execution 3 weeks after it had occurred, and that during those 3 weeks she had been teaching her classes and shopping for groceries, and having dinner with her children, while Mikhail had already been dead and buried in an unmarked grave she would never be permitted to find. Vera read the letter 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment where KGB agents had arrested Mikhail 8 years earlier, trying to understand how a 12-year sentence for possessing forbidden literature had transformed into execution by firing squad. She understood intellectually that the new charges and the additional trial had escalated the severity of his crimes in the eyes of the state, that his refusal to show remorse or modify his behavior had marked him as incorrigible, that the system had decided he was beyond rehabilitation. But what she understood with a clarity that felt like ice forming in her chest was that her phone call in 1965 had created the official record that made every subsequent punishment possible, that without her denunciation there would have been no arrest, no trial, no camp sentence, and no circumstances that could lead to the charges that resulted in his execution. She had told herself for 8 years that she had saved her family by cooperating with the authorities, but what she had actually done was set in motion a chain of events that ended with her husband being shot and buried in an unmarked hole in the ground somewhere in Mordovia. Vera did not tell Katya and Alexei about their father's execution for 2 weeks after receiving the notification, and when she finally gathered them in the small living room of their apartment and spoke the words, Katya's first question was not about how he had died, but about when. Vera said March, and Katya, now 20 years old and in her 3rd year at Moscow State University, looked at her mother with an expression of cold calculation and said that it was now May, that 6 weeks had passed, and that once again Vera had chosen to withhold the truth. Alexei, 17, and preparing for his final school examinations, said nothing at all during that conversation, simply stood up and walked out of the apartment, and when he returned 3 hours later, he went directly to his room without speaking. The distance that had been developing between Vera and her children for years became in that moment a chasm that no amount of explanation or justification could bridge. In the months and years that followed, Vera attempted to maintain the routines of normal family life, but the attempt was mechanical and ultimately futile. Katya completed her university degree and immediately accepted a position at a research institute in Leningrad, as far from Moscow and from her mother as she could reasonably justify on professional grounds. She returned for obligatory visits on major holidays but stayed for the minimum time courtesy required, and maintained an emotional distance that made clear she was present physically, but not in any meaningful sense. Alexei was accepted to a technical institute in Moscow, but moved into a dormitory rather than continue living in the apartment, citing the need to be closer to his classes, though the institute was actually farther from the dormitory than from Vera's building. He visited twice a year, always briefly, always with the stiff formality of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty. In 1976, Vera began attending an Orthodox church in a neighborhood far from where she lived, walking 40 minutes each way to a small building where services were conducted quietly for the few believers who had not been fully suppressed by decades of official atheism. She went to confession one afternoon in November and told the priest, an elderly man whose hand shook when he made the sign of the cross, that she had betrayed her husband to the authorities and that he had been executed because of her actions. The priest listened in silence and then asked whether she had repented, and Vera found that she could not answer the question because she did not know whether what she felt was genuine repentance or simply the desire to be free of guilt. The priest told her that God could forgive any sin that was truly repented, but that she would need to find a way to forgive herself, and Vera left the church knowing that self-forgiveness was something she would never achieve. By 1981, when Vera retired early from teaching at age 55, citing health problems that were real enough, though not as severe as she claimed, her life had contracted to a small apartment in a different part of Moscow and a handful of acquaintances who knew nothing about her history. She learned that Katya had married when she received a brief letter informing her of the fact 3 months after the wedding, and that she had a grandson when a photograph arrived in the mail with no accompanying note. Alexei called occasionally, conversations that lasted no more than 5 minutes and covered only the most superficial topics, and Vera understood that she was being kept at a distance that both her children had decided was necessary for their own emotional survival. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and announced the policies of glasnost and perestroika, Vera watched the changes with a growing dread that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the certainty that transparency would eventually expose what she had done. In 1987, new laws allowed families to request the files of relatives who had been convicted of political crimes. And in October of that year, Katya obtained Mikhail's complete case file from the Moscow archives. The file contained the original denunciation, filed by Vera Andreevna Volkova on December 28, 1965, along with detailed notes from her preparation sessions with KGB officers and the transcript of her testimony at trial. When Katya called to confront her mother, the conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Katya asked a single direct question, whether Vera had been the one who reported Mikhail to the authorities. And when Vera answered that she had been trying to protect the family, Katya said that their father was dead, and had been dead for 13 years, and that protection looked remarkably similar to murder when you examined it closely enough. Alexei learned the same information and responded differently, arriving at Vera's apartment unannounced one evening in November, and sitting across from her in silence for nearly an hour, before finally asking whether she had ever actually loved their father. Vera said yes. That love was precisely why she had thought she was helping him, and Alexei responded that she had killed Mikhail to save herself, and that everything else was simply justification constructed after the fact to make that killing bearable. He left without saying goodbye, and Vera did not see him again for 3 years, and when they did eventually resume contact, it was with the understanding that certain topics would never be discussed, and that their relationship would never be more than superficial courtesy. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, and Vera, now 67 years old and living alone in a 2-room apartment that seemed too large despite its modest size, watched on television as the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Everything she had been taught to believe, every principle she had been raised to uphold, every justification she had constructed for her actions, was revealed in those final days of 1991 to have been built on foundations that were crumbling into dust. The system she had betrayed her husband to appease had been revealed as corrupt and unsustainable, and the ideology she had placed above her marriage had been shown to be hollow. Most devastatingly, the rehabilitation of political prisoners that began in the late 1980s made clear that if Vera had simply done nothing in 1965, if she had chosen to protect her husband rather than report him, Mikhail would almost certainly have been freed during the reforms, and would have lived to see the collapse of the system that had imprisoned him. Vera died of heart failure in January 1994, at age 70, in a Moscow hospital with neither of her children present. Katya and Alexei came to Moscow for the funeral and to sort through their mother's belongings, and in a locked drawer in her desk they found every letter Mikhail had ever sent from the camp, carefully preserved and arranged chronologically, along with a diary that Vera had kept from 1965 until just weeks before her death. The diary entries documented her guilt in meticulous detail, page after page of self-recrimination and justification, circular reasoning that never reached resolution, and a final entry from December 1993 that read simply that she had told herself she was saving her family but had instead destroyed it more completely than any external force could have, that she had made a choice she believed was necessary, and had spent 28 years learning that necessity was not the same as rightness. Katya and Alexei took their father's letters and their mother's diary and drove to the region in Mordovia where the labor camp had been located, now abandoned and partly demolished after the Soviet collapse. They walked through the area where unmarked graves from the camp period were known to exist, unable to identify which patch of earth might contain their father's remains, and Alexei asked his sister whether she thought Mikhail would have forgiven Vera if he had lived long enough to be asked. Katya said she did not know, and that perhaps the more important question was whether Vera had ever forgiven herself, and they both knew the answer to that question was written in every page of the diary they had found. 28 years of entries that documented a guilt that had never diminished and a choice that could never be unmade.